Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar, The Impact of Inflation on Consumer Desire for Sustainability in Europe. My name is Jason Partridge. I'm the VP of Client Experience at Lux Research and one of the co-founders of Lux Motive Base. I'm going to be moderating your session today. Today presenting is my colleague and the other co-founder of Lux Motive Base, Ujwal Arkal Good, who's the acting EVP and Group Director at Lux Research. As we go through the webinar today, you can type any questions you have in the question box on your screen, and time permitting, we're going to do our very best to answer as many of the questions as we can. Just to put everybody's mind at ease, if your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. That's questions@luxresearchinc.com. And we will be happy to respond. But I am going to do my best to answer as many of those questions as possible while we have Ujwal here with us today. So at this point, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ujwal, and we're going to get started. Ujwal, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is obviously an important topic that pretty much everybody's grappling with. In particular, if you either service consumers directly or are catering to the FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods industry. This is obviously a critical topic. It's top of mind. And I think unsurprisingly for any of you, especially if you've attended any of our past webinars, you will know that as Lux Motive Base, we in particular live in the implicit. Our forte, our expertise is the identification of those implicit meanings, those emotional underpinnings that are actually driving human behavior. And sure enough, it's anything but logical in terms of how consumers are reacting to inflationary pressure. It's not that inflation has suddenly made people not want to buy sustainable products, not at all. In fact, it's kind of had, in a way, the opposite effect. What it's done is it's made consumers in Europe a lot more mindful and significantly more aware of the choices that they're making, much more than before. But there's a reason why they have become so much more aware. And the main reason is that they're now putting the onus on you, the corporation, to solve the problem, to deal with the inflationary challenges without reducing your efforts around sustainability and sustainable innovation. So this is the inherent challenge, that inflationary pressure has actually created more pressure from the consumer onto you as the corporation, the brand, showing up in the marketplace. And that's in essence what I mean by the implicit reaction to all of this. And because of that, consumers have become a lot more aware. Consumers very much look at corporations and the products they launch as the representations of the choices that these corporations are making, right? So your products are the representation of the choices you make out in the marketplace, and people want to see you making better choices, i.e. people want to see that reflected in the products they're buying. And this is of significant impact. Now, on your screen, you're looking at a maturity chart that comes from Motive Base. And this is a maturity chart looking at some key markets in Europe. So in order to do our analysis here, we looked at France, Germany, we looked at Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, as well as the UK. So those were the markets that we looked at in order to run our analysis. And what this maturity chart represents is the average maturity of the impact that inflationary pressure has had on how people think about corporate responsibility. So in green, you've got the consumer's understanding of corporate responsibility, which is in what we call mainstream maturity at 47.2%. Basically, what that tells us is there's a lot of consensus and meaning. Consumers' expectations around what your responsibility as a corporation is quite well formed, especially in Europe. It's a little bit further back in the US, but in Europe, quite well formed. But what's happening is the pressure of inflation and the desire for sustainability represented in orange there is growing significantly in that context. So throughout this presentation, you'll actually see how the desire for sustainability in the midst of inflationary pressure, how it's exerting certain amounts of pressure on some key areas or some key trends that are impacting consumer choice. So we're going to cover in particular 4 key areas that I really want to draw your attention to through this presentation. But just to kick us off, the key takeaway for you is the onus from the consumer is on you in order to solve this problem, they know that this is a high inflationary time. They know costs are a big issue, and they want you to react by innovating with your products and solutions. That's, in essence, the headline here. And you can see the pressure is massive on corporate responsibility. So on corporate responsibility, the biggest impact really that inflation is having, especially around the context of sustainability, is its impact on corporate responsibility and consumer expectations. So the next question probably in your mind is, how do we know this? And again, for those of you who have not attended one of these webinars, I'm going to do a quick roundup of how we know this as anthropologists, as a technology that applies anthropology to the study of language, in particular, the study of millions of conversations happening on the internet every single day. How do we do that? How do we apply anthropology, and how do we use that in order to decode these implicit meanings and then quantify them and understand their maturity? Let's dig into that for a second. Our job as anthropologists is fundamentally to decode meaning. So as anthropologists, we're less interested in what people are saying. We're interested in what they mean by what they say. We're interested in the subtext. We're interested in the implicit side of the meaning equation. When somebody says to you, "Oh, how are you? Oh, I'm feeling a bit tired," the anthropologist is interested in the subtext behind what tired means. That's the mindset of an anthropologist. Now you apply that into the technology landscape, where your data source, instead of that one person giving you feedback, is in fact millions and millions of people across Europe who are just engaging on their own volition. We're not asking them to engage on the topic of inflation and sustainability. We're simply scraping their information. It becomes really, really powerful. Now, to illustrate the power behind this type of anthropological model, I'm going to use a simple example and bring this to life, or at least try to bring this to life. On your screen, you've got a basic framework of the explicit associations that consumers make with the topic of food. So people connect food to indulgence or nutrition or sustainability or diet. Sure. What the anthropologist is concerned with is not that the connection between food and nutrition exists, but rather why it exists. What is the subtext behind it? And the way to explain this is to look at it holistically, look at it through the broader context of discourse that happens around food and nutrition. Because the way human beings engage is the conversation starts about food, goes to nutrition. From there, it goes to conversation about nutrition deficiency, then about B vitamins, and goes to sleep and metabolic energy. This is how human beings naturally engage. We connect topic A to topic B, C, D, and E. Sometimes those connections we make are implicit, as in they're associations of associations. They're not direct linkages, they're indirect linkages. A mathematician may say, "Oh, I need to distinguish an indirect linkage from a direct linkage." An anthropologist will say, "Is it in context?" If the answer is yes, we are not to discriminate against the indirect linkages. In fact, we are to focus on the indirect linkages, because it's in the associations of the associations where the implicit meaning lies, where the implicit perceptions that we create in our minds actually impact our day-to-day choices as human beings. So when we dig into that, we realize, okay, so the relationship between nutrition and food is actually mediated through a broader understanding of trying to impact our sleep in a more positive way, have more metabolic energy, and consume better nutrition and cut down on our deficiencies, especially on B vitamins and so on. And now suddenly you have so much more context, which means you can innovate better, you can respond better, and so on. Now, this idea of implicit, this system of implicit meaning that exists in this purple and bluish color or teal color, this is what we are tapping into, this technology, in order to understand what is happening beyond the obvious in connection to inflation and sustainability. Because the obvious, I don't need to do a webinar to talk to you about that. Our job is to get to what's happening beyond that. And in particular, what we found through our analysis is that, lo and behold, there are actually 4 major areas, as I alluded to earlier, where there's an implicit impact, or there are implicit meanings developing around the impact or around the changes to people's minds and behaviors as a result of inflationary pressure and this desire to make more sustainable choices. fundamentally, we talked about how consumers believe that corporations should bear the burden better. But in particular, this is translating into 4 key areas: elevating the in-home. We'll talk about each of these, by the way. The second one being about local impact. Sounds obvious, but there's some subtle pieces here that we'll dig into. Healthier choices. And then my favorite one about fewer aesthetics, or deprioritizing aesthetics, at least in how we make choices and how we choose products and solutions. So let's begin with the first one, elevate in-home. This has been a trend for a while, especially through the pandemic. This trend certainly grew, this idea that we wanted to elevate the experiences we have in-home, maybe cook better things, eat better at home, try to do more interesting activities at home, and so on and so forth. But what inflation and our desire for sustainability has done is that it has exerted a little bit of, in fact, I would almost say negative pressure on this shift. So in fact, this shift towards elevating in-home, while it was growing for a long time, has now suddenly become volatile. So for the first time, you may not be able to read that, but don't worry, we'll circulate slides after. You'll see in the chart that the topic is actually exhibiting volatility, which basically tells us that the culture of elevating in-home is become, or is no longer achieving greater consensus, is no longer growing in people's minds. And one of the reasons for it is the impact of inflationary pressure and this desire for sustainable buying or sustainable living. Now, within that though, despite it becoming volatile, there are some interesting things happening in this space. So first and foremost, the impact of this on inflation and sustainability is quite low, as we've established, but there are some interesting things happening. The biggest thing that's happening is, despite a little bit of a slowdown in this desire to elevate in-home, there is still very much this desire to increase the feeling of self-sufficiency. It's a natural emotional byproduct of this trend of elevating in-home. So what do we mean by that? It means doing things, potentially introducing things into your lives that gives you the feeling of being a bit more self-sufficient. Whether it's trying little things like, vertical gardening solutions and growing your own food, or trying DIY kits for cleaning products and personal care products, or even, upcycling kits and workshops, transforming old things into new, or even the latest trend or craze of freeze cakes. So, different types of desserts that you might now be able to have on the fly, easily available through your freezer in your home after dinner, let's say, and things like that. These are all good examples of how we're trying to elevate the in-home. We're trying to create a better feeling of self-sufficiency. But what inflation has done is it's actually slowed down this desire, which is actually counterintuitive, because you would think that in high inflationary pressure, you'd want to go out less, you'd want to eat more at home, try to save costs. So it is counterintuitive, and this is why this stuff is so interesting. And by the way, related to this, we did look at the trend around socialization. Socialization continues to be important in Europe. It's not going anywhere. The main difference is that inflation has changed people's choices in terms of where they might go to socialize, which restaurants they might go to eat, as an example, and things like that. But it certainly has not accelerated elevate in-home. So first big aha, right? Counterintuitive. The second one, which I want to dig into, because you'll slowly see that these are ordered in order of impact. So in order of impact that inflation and the desire for sustainability is really having. So second one is local. Obviously, local has been trending for a while. As you can see on your chart in green, it is an established idea, especially in Europe. The access to local is significantly higher than various parts of North America, as an example. A local is nothing new, but the impact of inflation and sustainability is slowly growing on creating some new changed requirements around what is local and what is considered local, where consumers are expressing interest around things like direct-to-consumer distribution models and localized distribution models, and they want to see the impact of seasonality on what corporations offer. Again, you may look at some of these things and say, well, it's not black and white. Localized distribution does not guarantee cheaper costs for the consumer. That may very much be the case, but the point is that in a high inflationary environment where people don't want to give up on their desire for sustainability, when people see direct-to-consumer models, when people see localized distribution, when people see corporations saying, oh, something isn't seasonal, they automatically assume, they create a proxy. They automatically assume that what? Let's go back to the very first slide we began with. They automatically assume that you are making changes in how you go to market. You're making changes in your product in order to respond to the changing climate. You are taking on the burden of responsibility. And that proxy is critical because it not only allows you to earn equity in the mind of the consumer, but drives choice and decision making. So ultimately, everything comes back to that, right? It's about creating the allure for the consumer by showing that you're doing your part. So again, within this space, there are a number of things that people are discussing around local impact, and some things are beyond the obvious. For example, desiring, creator collaborations across various disciplines. Desiring better communication of the origins of a product, highlighting local sourcing where possible. Talking about, obviously things like localized distribution as a way to reduce carbon footprint, perhaps even stabilize prices. This is something consumers talk about. Obviously, when they think about DTC, direct to consumer, they talk about cutting out middlemen and therefore cutting out costs. Again, from your perspective, this may not necessarily be a cost-cutting measure, but from the consumer's perspective, it is. And that's the important takeaway for us, because the way the consumer sees it is a local distribution center means decreased transportation costs and a reduction of the carbon footprint. They don't think about the broader picture of how all of that comes to bear. And I think that's the point here, is we have to be able to understand and deliver against the changing expectations within an inflationary environment. The third one is, again, inflation's having an impact on how people think about health and how people think about making healthier choices. Again, you'll notice that this desire to make healthier choices in the mainstream in green in your maturity curve, and the push or the impact of inflation and this desire for sustainability is starting to grow. On our impact chart on the left, you'll notice it's at 2.5 bars. So as we're going down our list, we're on number 3. The impact of inflation and our desire for sustainability is a positive one on health. So in essence, what it's doing is, in this inflationary environment, the way we think about our health and the types of choices we make for our health are changing. And in fact, a deeper focus on health is very much a result of people navigating the inflationary environment in the midst of their desire for conscious consumption. So how is this playing out? Here are some examples of some of the key things people are discussing. Obviously, plant-based still very much part of that. It is, I should point out, is very much not about moving to a vegan diet, but rather about incorporating plant-based ingredients and diets in a really smart and optimized way, which, by the way, we're also going to talk about in our upcoming forum in Chicago. But it's about incorporating plant-based ingredients, sources. It's about incorporating sustainably sourced products. It's about being more open about nutritional information. And in general, it's about having a healthier home environment, which includes a better focus on things like air quality. So overall, incorporation of better health, I think the big takeaway is it's not just about what we eat. It's a part of it, but it's about the broader environment within which we live. So again, the inflationary environment and our desire for sustainability is actually pushing our desire for healthier choices forward, and it's changing some of the requirements and widening our aperture around how we think about human health. Another one is ethical clothing. Obviously, we've talked a lot about this, but and I'm sure none of this is new to you, but what's important to point out is, again, the definition of ethics is broadening to include obviously organic materials, recycled materials, fair trade, fair wages for workers. All of that is very much part of that. So ethics is very much, certainly a lot more than how we might technically define sustainability. But I think, again, alludes back to the underlying idea that we began this session with, which is that what inflation has done is it's made people really think about every single decision they're making. And they want to see you respond with all your products and solutions by making small incremental gains, because that's when they see you taking on the burden of making more sustainable choices. And that's critical in order to drive purchase, in order to drive intent, obviously, in purchase, and then obviously to drive better equity. And then last one, zero waste products. Again, the desire for waste-free lifestyle, very much part of health in the mind of the consumer, and very much something that is being positively impacted by inflationary environment. So again, no surprise here. A lot of the things we're seeing are quite counterintuitive, because you might think logically, hey, in a high inflationary environment, people should actually stop caring about their health and just buy things they can afford. But this is why anthropologists exist, because human beings are anything but logical. It's these idiosyncrasies that we are built to capture and understand. And then the last one is fewer aesthetics. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of my favorite areas. It's one of my favorite areas because, in essence, for the first time, prioritizing other things over aesthetics has actually become a status symbol. So when you buy products that are ugly, you are doing something for the environment. That's the simplest way I can explain it. In an inflationary environment, obviously we've all seen the movement towards minimal packaging and reduced packaging materials and reduced, single-use plastics and all of that stuff. But what's really interesting is the impact that the inflationary environment is having is it's turned buying things that don't look so good as a proxy for buying or making better choices, more sustainable choices. And I think this is fascinating, because it opens the door for many of our brands to potentially take on formats, packages, things that might actually save us money in the long run. And some of the things that people discuss, they'll obviously talk about bulk shopping as a way to reduce waste, increase affordability. They'll talk about refill stations. Again, this is about everything from food to cleaning products to personal care products to the overall discussion about reduction in waste and use of plastics. DIY appearance. This is, again, alludes back to the point I was making earlier, that the product almost looks like it could have been homemade. Because it's not as polished. It looks like it could have been homemade. It looks like it could have been packaged at home by a 10-year-old. And I think there's some power to that. And again, this shift, this movement, we've seen different forms of it. So, for example, there are organizations in Europe, in North America, that use, for example, ugly-looking produce from retailers and grocery stores, and make sure that they're not wasted but rather resold. There are restaurants that will specifically buy not so good looking fruits and vegetables and meat so as to play their role in minimizing waste. This is not new. We've seen these little shifts and movements sprinkle along our journey over the last decade. But again, what inflation's done is it's put this further into focus and has accelerated the movement towards these. Which brings us back to the sort of overall slides we began with. If you think about the opportunities before us, really the opportunities to start at the bottom and move our way upwards, I think there are a few things that are quite counterintuitive. In particular, the focus on aesthetics, the fact that something could be more premium, something could be more sustainable, something could be better for you if it looks a little worse than its competitors, if it looks like it's DIY, it looks like it's a bit messy. I think there's something immensely powerful about that, and a great movement shift in that direction, great proxy developing in culture as a result of the inflationary environment. Health, we talked about how it's a bit counterintuitive in the sense that actually our adoption of healthy habits has further increased, or the pressure has further increased in the inflationary environment. It's not the opposite, so it's counterintuitive. And the reason ultimately is because we believe that by adopting healthier habits, we decrease the strain on the system, our healthcare systems, our overall social support systems. And in an inflationary environment, we see that as a positive outcome. So that's really, really fascinating and interesting to see how consumers make that linkage and bring that to life. We talked about local, which I will say is a bit more on the logical side. And then, of course, we talked about the counterintuitive idea that actually elevating in-home has come to a bit of a halt because of the inflationary environment, ironically enough. You could allude or attribute part of that to post-pandemic. People want to be outside. They want to do as much as they can outside. But I would also attribute it to the fact that in an inflationary environment, people don't always want to do things that make them feel worse. People want to find ways to make the most of what they have. That's human tendency, which is why you see so much of sort of illogical behavior, if I can put it that way, that really comes to bear and comes to life. But ultimately, these are the opportunities. And I think if there's one takeaway for you, it's ultimately that the onus is on you. We began this presentation by saying what inflation has really done is it's put the onus back on you. It's asked you as the corporation, as the brand, to take a leadership position, to take on the burden of bringing new products and solutions. What that quite literally translates into is consumers want to see you do new things. They want to see you do iterative things in this environment because that tells them you are taking on that burden. It tells them that you are helping them continue on their journey rather than abandon their journey towards sustainable living. And this is really, really critical in Europe. Very different in the US, but critical in Europe. The second one, we talked about the focus or the decreased focus on aesthetics, turning ugly into beautiful. I love that idea. And then, of course, this whole idea that health is so much more than food. It's about how we choose to live our lives, and our onus and the onus we put on our health or our healthy environments definitely increased in the inflationary environment. With that said, thank you for joining us today. I'm happy to take questions or any comments.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ujwal. We are going to start hammering through some of the questions. I will set expectations. I don't think we're going to get through all of them today because there are quite a few. So I'm doing my best to moderate and kind of pick some ones that I think that there's some kind of overlap. But once again, if you didn't get your question answered, please remember that I provided the email at the beginning. And if you asked a question here and we don't get to it, we will reach out to you afterwards. But let me jump in right at that kind of that first point that you have on the screen there, Uj. You talked a little bit about the impact of COVID and the impact of the pandemic in relation to some of the kind of trends that we saw. But in relation to this key takeaway, this notion that the responsibility lies on the shoulders of the corporation, do you think that that is something that was kind of driven or inflated by the whole notion of COVID and the pandemic?
I think you might be right. We certainly saw many examples, Jason, when we were studying the impact of the pandemic, both in the early stages and in the later stages of global, across global markets.
Yeah.
We saw a lot where consumers actually expressed a great deal of displeasure on from the perspective of the consumer, that corporations did very little in order to react. Other than flooding the market with their products and making their products available, corporations didn't innovate during that stage in the way that the consumer would have expected. So I think you're right. I wouldn't be surprised if part of this is a bit of a hangover from the pandemic. But I think ultimately this is the point I really wanted to harp on, is in a high inflationary environment, if we have to put our consumer hats on, our people hat on. When you put the people hat on, people don't understand our logistical challenges. They don't understand our operational challenges. They don't understand our cost structures. All they understand is when they see a product with your brand name in the store doing something for them that it didn't do before, that's their language, right? 100%. So we have to be able to translate that into that language, otherwise we lose.
I think that's great. I think that one of the other things that we saw as we did work throughout the pandemic around the world is that there was, in a lot of instances in countries where there was the illusion of grand support, a lot of people opened their eyes to how independent we actually are when push comes to shove. And one of the few things that people have control over is what they spend their money on. And so if there is a corporation that is basically kind of helping them better achieve their values that align with what they want from a sustainability standpoint, and allows them to basically kind of maneuver through complicated scenarios from an inflationary standpoint, then that immediately causes the kind of the proverbial cream to rise to the crop in that particular instance. So I do think from that standpoint, there was a little bit of amplification as a result of COVID. It opened our eyes for a number of consumers to be looking at things a little bit differently than we did before.
That's a fantastic point. Was that a point from you, or was that a comment that somebody left?
Sadly for you, Ujwal, it was a point from me, so you're going to have to give me points on that one.
It's a fantastic point. I just actually wanted to jump in on that for a second because there are a couple of things, right? One is, oftentimes we think it doesn't make any sense. Why would somebody, if they're more constrained in terms of their budget, their monthly budgets, why would somebody not just cut what they spend on groceries? Or what they spend on cleaning products, or what they spend on skincare products. And what we don't realize is that when people are stressed, first, there are two things that happen. This is very common across industry. When people are stressed, immediately our brains will create an organization of things that are really important to us. So for example, if I'm somebody that really values my skincare products, that's the last thing I will compromise on. So I'll compromise on other things. That's the first thing we do. We organize it in terms of priority. So for example, if paying attention and making a contribution to the environment and buying healthier cleaning products for the home for my kids is important to me, that's not going anywhere. Instead, what's going to happen is, since it's not going anywhere, now I'm going to become a lot more rigid in terms of what I look for. I'm going to be less open to potentially, just trying things without really knowing and understanding them. And I'm going to look for and ask questions that are important to me as a consumer. So I think that's the point that I just wanted to build on a little bit, because it's really important for us to understand that human beings do not react in a logical way. Human beings value things based on the meaning we assign to those things. That's why we do this type of work.
Well, building off of that and segueing off the notion of meaning and why people do things, in the Elevate the in-home experience kind of section, we talked a little bit about the different solutions that are coming, and it seemed like there was a bit of a pattern. So the question that we got asked was around this whole notion of, it seems like the consumers really want to feel like they're part of a process, so that they're willing to literally, quote unquote, do things to save money, to promote sustainability, and to kind of promote kind of betterment for the planet. Can you talk a little bit about why they want that and why they're willing to do that? And the person was specifically calling out, what role does social status play in regards to kind of a little bit of what we're seeing here?
Right. Great point. Actually, there's two things here. There's a lot of studies in the field of the social sciences, especially sociology, that talks about how when our society is constrained, the number of little things that we use to build our symbolic capital, symbolic power, build social status in our peer groups increases. So when society is constrained, we become so much more particular and so much more stringent about trying to build our social status vis-a-vis our peer group. And inflation is a classic example of that type of constraint. And when that constraint happens, what do? You don't want to show the world, kinks in your armor, weaknesses. And you try to use that as a way to ensure that, for example, your peer group doesn't see you completely abandoning your interest or your desire to live a more sustainable life. In fact, that would be disastrous for your social standing in your peer group. So I think we have to put this into perspective. If you take somebody, let's say on the other end of that spectrum, who has never cared about sustainability, yes, inflation is having no impact on their desire. But what we're doing here is really talking about, this whole webinar was focused on the impact of inflation on our desire for sustainability. So people who have a desire for sustainability, what is their reaction to inflationary pressure? The headline is that it's not making them run away from sustainability. It's just changing some of the requirements, and it's making them more particular about what they look for. And I think that's what we have to take away from this. That's
great. regarding in fewer, the consumer looking for fewer aesthetics.
Right.
And this whole notion of minimalism being a sign of quote unquote a better choice. The question is, how do we think this is going to impact the luxury sector? And how would you help a luxury brand understand how to react to this type of trend or cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean, a fantastic question. I can't, unfortunately, answer this question because I haven't specifically examined this in the context of luxury. The benefit of our technology is, and please feel free to reach back out to us. The benefit of our technology is we can slice and dice culture based on topics and language, right? So we can look at how this focus on less aesthetics specifically translates in the context of luxury and specifically in the context of a particular type of luxury product. No problem at all. But I can comment overall to say that within each context, there is a norm of aesthetic. The best way to think about it is there's a reduction in that requirement. So within each context, whether it's the context of luxury or a mass market product, there's a norm. And what we're saying is that norm is dropping, is changing, and we can be creative with that norm as a way to allude to the fact that we're being more sustainable. If in the process we can also save on costs, amazing. That's a win-win for everybody.
Great answer. I have a question here in and around education. And I think that the question is, how should the clients think about their role in regards to kind of the key users today, the kind of key consumers that really get this versus the more mainstream audiences that may not fully understand and may not be able to connect those dots? Can you just talk a little bit about kind of how a corporation might want to think about their role in not only basically kind of actioning on these insights, but how to think about rolling out an initiative and how to think about transitioning from here's what we're going to do to here's how we're going to basically help people understand what we're going to do?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to think about it is, we talk a lot about influencers in our industry, but we don't actually apply the principles of influence. So the principles of influence teach us that if you imagine sort of a line from left to right, and for those of you who have attended one of our old webinars, this will sound familiar. There's a natural tension that exists between the left end of that spectrum and the right end. All trends begin on the theoretical left and they graduate to the right. And as they graduate in maturity, thinking back to, for example, I'll go back to one of the original slides here where we had our maturity. If you think back to where something sits in maturity, the audience that is currently leading the charge is your influencer. So the key question to always ask is, okay, so if the impact of inflation and sustainability sits at early consensus stage and it's at 27.8%, who is really in the driver's seat? Who is what we call the lead consumer at the moment? Because if we can identify who that lead consumer is, that's the consumer you need to be speaking to and catering to, because that's the consumer that will drive and push influence further into the mainstream if there is forecasted growth. And if that's the case, then that's sort of the perfect setting and the perfect environment for you to do that. Oftentimes we make the mistake of trying to be everything to everybody right off the bat, and that just does not work with any kind of new launches, especially in a situation like this where we're catering to people's desire for sustainability. It never works. You have to understand who the lead user is, and you have to build with the lead user and understand what their cultural requirements are, and sort of take the journey with them, if you will.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much, Ujwal. If this was an awards ceremony, the music would be playing. So we're going to have to wrap it there. Again, I apologize to everybody who didn't get their question answered, but we chatted about what we will do as a result. This will conclude our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all of the attendees via email later on today. And after leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We'd really, really appreciate any feedback that you can provide, because it really helps inform and helps us improve all of our future webinars. So take a moment, check that out, and also, kind of take a look for all the upcoming webinars that are coming from Lux as an organization. But with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.